now I'd like to welcome, without any delay, Rachel Newton, who's chair, I think, of Greece Solidarity Campaign? Secretary, National Secretary of a Greece Solidarity Campaign. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you. I'm really pleased to be here today speaking for the Greece Solidarity Campaign. I'd actually prepared a 10-minute speech, so I'll just try and talk very quickly and get through it because I know Elaine will speed me up. The simple aim of the Greece Solidarity Campaign is to offer political and practical solidarity to all those fighting austerity and its terrible effects on the people who live in Greece. I've been to Greece twice as part of solidarity delegations, including last March, where we had a joint delegation with the Fire Brigades Union. We visited, as well as political and trade union leaders opposing austerity in Greece, we met with public service and community activists who are resisting and organising solidarity within communities. And we learnt about how people are being mobilised through this to meet urgent needs for themselves and their neighbours, but at the same time promoting the belief that an alternative system that puts social needs before profits is both possible and essential. And that idea about doing both of these things in tandem came up again and again. We saw the growing social health clinics networks that Fred mentioned earlier, and we learned of the community solidarity action to stop evictions, to distribute food, the social markets where farmers were selling direct to consumers, the campaigns to demand fuel to heat schools through the winter, and the efforts to support workers-controlled co-ops. Among many of the meetings and visits we had was one visit to one of the country's largest public hospitals, which coincidentally is the same hospital that a few days later Golden Dawn supporters armed with bats went in a publicity stunt to intimidate migrant workers. The medical staff that we met there told us about the collapse of the public health system through the twin policies of savage cuts and privatisation, with growing numbers of people not entitled to free healthcare, coming into hospitals with treatable conditions and leaving again without having had the treatment they need or the further tests that they need, and then just coming back to hospital once their conditions have become chronic or even terminal. One of the neurosurgeons that we met described how they're having to reuse gauzes and how they run out of things like gloves as well as essential drugs. We learned about how there's a two-tier system even within the public hospital itself, how the government has sought to buy off doctors who have seen a big wage cut by legalising payments that people can make to jump the queue within hospitals. And we learnt about how hospitals are being closed down, staff numbers cut to the bone, one nurse to wards of 42 patients, and how private companies like Siemens are moving in to suck out the funding from the health service for private profit. And we also saw the fight back, joint campaigns between health workers and communities, and we visited social health clinics staffed by volunteers. Many of the same doctors and nurses that we met at the hospital were volunteers in these clinics, and they provide free healthcare to all those who need it, operating on donations of drugs, equipment and money. And we learnt from activists that the purpose of these clinics was not to replace the public sector, but was part of a campaign, as well as meeting urgent and immediate need, but as part of a campaign for a model of a new publicly funded health system and showing a way of developing primary care as part of that new system. On the advice of comrades in Greece, the Solidarity Campaign in the UK has launched medical aid for Greece to support these social clinics, and we've had the first £2,000 raised recently from the NUT, Unite, CERTUC and the TSSA unions. So we'll be building on that through the trade union movement, and for anyone who's planning to be at the Trade Union Congress this year, we're holding a joint fringe meeting with the FBU. The purpose of the appeal is to first raise money. It's not charity, but it's to support this essential part of the anti-austerity movement and its projects as it's been developed in Greece. But also importantly from our point of view, it's a way of widening support for Greece amongst people in the UK. It's impossible for people here in the UK to see the situation with the health system in Greece without drawing parallels to what's happening here with the NHS, and generally to see what our future is if we don't fight. So now we have the latest crisis of rule in Greece. If the government falls and if Greece elects a radical anti-austerity government, then it's a game changer for the whole world. As was mentioned earlier, such a government will of course be vilified by ruling elites everywhere and pressurised from all sides, including by the UK government. From our own rulers' point of view, an anti-austerity government cannot be allowed to succeed, and from our point of view, it absolutely has to succeed. In the UK, the People's Assembly was a big step towards building a mass anti-austerity movement here, and one of the powerful messages from that movement is that this is part of something that's worldwide, that what is happening in Greece and Portugal and Spain is our fight too. And this is absolutely a concrete and not an abstract slogan. When Cameron raised the question of a referendum on Europe, he quoted Angela Merkel when she said explicitly that either Europe's production has to increase or its social spending reduced, and preferably both. So more work for less wages and less on education, health spending, pensions, welfare per person. And she said this was needed to protect the European standard of living. And what is clear is that exactly the opposite is intended for the 99% of us. And it is this standard and every social gain that we've won that Merkel, echoed by Cameron here, has declared war on. And Greece shows all of Europe and the world that there is a political will for them to carry out this programme with ruthless force. We're used to talking about the impact of globalisation being the race to the bottom, and of course for many workers in Europe they already exist, are forced to exist at this bottom. The Turkish guest workers in Germany, the Nigerian and Chinese workers in the UK, North Africans in France, the Roma in Italy, etc., working often below minimum wage and with no social rights. Merkel's proposition for Europe, entirely supported by Cameron in this country, is for a wholesale restructuring that starts to make this the standard for workers across Western Europe. The UK austerity programme is part of this drive, as it is in Ireland, Portugal, Spain and Italy and elsewhere. Sorry, I'm going to try and cut what I was going to say down.
No cuts. Well, cuts to Dryden, cuts to Rachel's long speech.
Okay. I think that in Greece, I know that there's a live and sometimes polarised debate about how far the indigenous ruling elites and institutions are responsible for Greece's catastrophe, and how far versus the austerity policies of international capitalist organisations. And I can absolutely see why Greek activists would want to make their own rulers accountable for their actions, while the movement focuses on the Troika. The Greek elite would give those running the City of London a run for their money if there was a competition of being parasitical and criminally corrupt, and you just have to look at the Greek shipping magnates to see that. And while the Troika may be imposing the memorandum, it's the Greek government that orders the riot police to smash up opposition, and the Greek colonels are hovering in the wings. But the imposition of the austerity memorandum in Greece by the Troika is an attack on democracy and national sovereignty. The second memorandum explicitly tries to forbid the Greek government, any Greek government, to borrow money to service the debts from anywhere else, which can only be understood as an attempt to tie the hands of a new anti-austerity government. And there is a danger that focusing on the homegrown wreckers of the Greek economy, rather than their colleagues in the Troika, could strengthen the false notion that this is a Greek-specific situation, and tying into all of the rubbish in the Greek, British and German media about how this is Greek is so unusually corrupt and so unusually indebted, etc. The reality is that the interests of Greek tycoons and corrupt politicians cannot be separated from those of the Troika. The Greek debt is the result of loans from the EU Central Bank to the Greek government, arranged by the City of London, in particular the City branch of Goldman Sachs. Lucas Papadamos was the unelected MP in Greece in 11-12, who was in charge of forcing through the first memoranda, was previously the Vice Chair and Managing Director of Goldman Sachs in the 1990s, at exactly the same time when they were helping the Greek government to paint a false picture of the Greek finances to gain entry into the EU to get their hands on those loans. And the same man went on to become the Governor of the Bank of Greece, later bailed out by the Greek people, etc., etc. You couldn't make it up, and you could go through, you know, the Greek elite are not unusual in this. Look at Mario Monti in Italy, look at Peter Sutherland in Ireland, both central leaders of Goldman Sachs, and we could go on and on through that list. So this is why the fight for the Greek people are leading is our fight. While a section of the ruling class in the UK may have decided that it is in the interest of the City of London at the moment to be best served by being outside of the EU, Cameron's agenda is the same as Merkel's agenda. And for Greece, what stands in the way of progress and of hope for a more productive and caring society is the Troika, aided and abetted by their friends and allies within the Greek establishment. So the last point I would like to make is people around the globe, including Western and Southern European countries like Greece, Turkey, Ireland, of course have had a long history of having to migrate to find work. Because of the economic crisis, this is now extending hugely, particularly amongst young people right across Europe, with the crisis of youth unemployment reaching epic proportions. In any struggle for progress, young people are at its centre, and this can be made harder if young people are being forced to move around. But we can learn that it carries advantages too. The Greek activists living in London have been central to the Greek Solidarity campaign in the UK from the start, and has been immeasurably strengthened as a result. One of the many reasons why we need to campaign on a European-wide basis is to ensure that this energy is not dispersed and that it makes us more internationalist in our outlook. And on a practical level, it can help us to organise the coordinated action that we've been talking about. The Greece Solidarity campaign is keen to support coordinated campaigns. We've supported, backing the campaigns on the debt, the European-wide campaigns, the Anti-Fascist Manifesto, the Day of Action last November, and I was absolutely delighted to hear announced in the last session about the 4-point manifesto from the Alta Summit, and I think that's something that we need to take forward in all of the campaigns we're involved in. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to all our speakers, but before we finish, we have a few words from Luisa in Brazil. From Brazil?
Can I?
Yes, you just